My kitchen, my table, my burden. That's what it had become over the years. I used to think setting the table was an act of love. The clink of forks and plates, the simmer of stew on the stove, the worn recipe cards smudged with memories. I remember how I'd hum to myself while folding napkins, the kind of humming you do when your heart is full. But that feeling had long since soured into something else. I don't quite remember when it shifted. Maybe it was the year they started arriving late, not bothering to call, or the Christmas when they all brought store-bought desserts and complimented each other for it, never noticing the hours I'd spent perfecting my cranberry tart. Little things, quiet things, the kind of slights that don't have sharp edges, they just wear you down like water carving stone. My house was always the gathering place. Birthdays, holidays, the odd midweek emergency where someone just needed a break from their partner or roommate. The front door opened like a revolving one. They called it homey, which meant I kept it clean and warm. I kept the fridge stocked. I kept the towels washed and the beds made. I kept everything running, but no one ever asked how I was keeping up. That's the thing about being dependable. Once people see you as steady, they forget you're also breakable. The last dinner I hosted before it all started unraveling was supposed to be small, just the immediate family. But just the immediate family had ballooned over the years into partners plus ones, freeloading cousins and their children. I counted 13 chairs, 13 mouths, 13 napkins I folded myself while my knees ached and my back pinched with every bend. Not one person offered to help, not even to slice the bread. And when they finally sat down after I called out dinner's ready 3 times, no one even looked at me. They just ate. I sat down last like always, and by then the stuffing had already cooled, and the gravy had a film on top. I watched them reach over each other, their voices rising in laughter, clinking glasses, clinking forks, never once saying thank you, never once saying, "You must be tired." And when I stood to grab an extra spoon from the drawer, one of them, I won't say who, looked at me and said, "Oh, could you also grab some salt while you're up?" Like I was a waitress, like I was born to serve. I smiled. I always smiled. That quiet, soft-lipped smile you practice in the mirror when you don't want to cry. The kind of smile that keeps things civil even as your heart folds in on itself like an old letter no one wants to read. I told myself I was being sensitive, that they didn't mean anything by it, that they loved me. Of course they did. But love without respect is just sentiment. It's a pat on the head, a signature on a birthday card. It's hollow. After dinner, the table was left in disarray. Someone turned on the TV in the living room. Someone else cracked open a beer and left the cap on the counter. I stood there, surrounded by crumpled napkins and sticky plates, and I waited. I waited to see if anyone would stand up, anyone would offer to help. I waited until the house quieted, and the only sound left was the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breath, shallow and tired. No one came. So I cleaned it all, every plate, every fork, every wine glass, with smudged lipstick on the rim. I cleaned until my fingers were pruned and my shoulders trembled. I wiped the table. I wiped the counters. I mopped the floor where someone had dropped a little gravy and stepped in it without noticing. I threw out their trash and washed their leftovers, and when I finally sat down in the kitchen chair, the one with the small crack in the leg that I keep forgetting to fix, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no gratitude, just silence. And the sinking feeling that maybe this was all I was to them now. Not a mother, not a woman with a story, a soul, a voice, just a set of hands, just a kitchen, just an extra room in a house they didn't pay for but felt entitled to use. I looked at the space around me, the chipped tile, The old curtains, the photograph of me and their father on the fridge now yellowing, and I wondered when this had stopped being mine. That night, as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, I paused halfway up. I looked down at the empty, quiet kitchen, and I thought next time maybe I won't cook. Maybe I'll just let them be hungry. But I already knew they wouldn't notice. The visit that turned my stomach came on a Tuesday. I remember because it was laundry day. The hallway smelled like fresh fabric softener, and I had just finished folding a mountain of towels, each one lined up neatly in the cupboard like soldiers. The doorbell rang, and I thought it might be the neighbor dropping off another bag of lemons from her overflowing tree. I opened the door expecting sunshine and citrus. Instead, it was him, a nephew from my husband's side, the kind of relative that doesn't call on birthdays or write at Christmas, but somehow always knows when your door is still open. He smiled that too-wide smile duffel bag, in one hand, cheap energy drink in the other. "Hey, Auntie," he said, like I'd been expecting him. "Mind if I crash here for a bit? Just lost my job. Just until I get back on my feet." Before I could form a proper thought, let alone a sentence, he was already inside, brushing past me like wind through a door that had been left cracked too long. I didn't say no. I didn't even ask for how long. That was my mistake, one of many, because I've been trained, conditioned, really, to make space, to accommodate, to carry the weight without ever dropping it. And so I showed him the guest room, and freshened the sheets, told him where the towels were, and offered to make him tea like some weary innkeeper whose kindness had become muscle memory. That night he joined dinner unannounced. I had made lentil stew simple and filling, and he picked at it like it was slop. "Don't you have any meat?" he asked, loud enough for the whole table to hear. The others laughed, and someone said, "You better get used to Auntie's rabbit food." I smiled again, that silent, invisible smile. But inside, something cold moved across my ribs, like a wind slipping under a closed door. He stayed. Days turned to weeks. He didn't look for work, didn't lift a finger. He slept in late and monopolized the living room TV feed, on my coffee table crumbs in the cushions. He called friends on speakerphone late into the night. Once I found the bathroom sink clogged with his shaved stubble and toothpaste spit. I asked him to be more mindful. He shrugged. "Chill. It's not a hotel." No, it wasn't. But I began to wish it were. At least hotels charge a fee. At least hotel guests respect the checkout time. The worst part wasn't him. It was the others, the way they pretended not to see. My daughter said, "Oh, he's just going through a tough patch." My son said he's family. My granddaughter said it's only temporary. Temporary. The word tasted like metal. Everything about him was temporary, his job, his home, his manners. But the burden he brought, that lingered. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, the air thick with the smell of burnt toast. He had used my good pan, left it on the stove, crusted and scorched. I was scrubbing it with steel wool when I looked up and saw my reflection in the window, my hair unbrushed, my nightgown spotted, my face sagging not just with age, but with a kind of quiet, unspoken sorrow. I didn't recognize myself. I looked like someone who'd been slowly erased, someone whose name had been crossed out not in anger, but in laziness, a woman whose role had been reduced to background noise. I wanted to scream, but the words they got caught somewhere in my throat, trapped behind years of, "It's fine and don't worry about it, and I'm just happy to help," because I had always helped. I had made it my purpose, my penance, my pride. And now it was being taken for granted by someone who saw me, not as a person, but as a convenience. The fridge was always emptier, the trash always fuller. He drank the last of the milk and left the carton in the door. He finished the orange juice and put it back empty. He used the last roll of toilet paper and never thought to replace it. These aren't crimes, you know. not individually. But they're signs, small signs that someone believes they are entitled to your space, your time, your energy, without giving anything in return. And the others, they adjusted. They made room for him at the table. They laughed at his jokes, no matter how crude. They praised his hustle when he started selling knockoff sunglasses online. I watched as they embraced him, accepted him, normalized him, and in doing so, they erased me a little more each day. One evening he brought home a friend. No warning, just walked through the door with a second stranger trailing behind him saying, "This is Mike. He's cool. He just needs a place to crash for a couple nights." I stared at them stunned, and he looked at me with this blank, expectant face, like I should already be fluffing the pillows and boiling water for tea. That's when it turned, not in some loud, explosive way, but quietly. Inside, like the last crack spreading through a plate that's been chipped for years. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed and listened to their voices drift through the house, to the sound of careless feet stomping down my hallways, to the laughter that never once included me. And I realized I had let them turn my home into something I no longer recognized. I had handed over every inch of it. Not just the rooms, but the love inside it, the memories, the years. I wasn't just tired, I was invisible, and I was done pretending not to see it. Sleeping on crumbs, feeding kings, that's what it had come to. Every morning I'd wake before the sun even considered rising. My bones, stiff ankles swollen from the day before I'd shuffle into the kitchen, where the air still smelled faintly of someone else's late-night snacking. I'd brew coffee. I wouldn't get to finish toast bread. I wouldn't get to eat and begin another day of feeding people who acted like I was some ancient appliance, reliable, silent, and easy to ignore. The guest, that nephew of my husband's, had settled in like mold in a damp corner. He left his shoes by the couch, not the door. He let his dishes soak for days, as if water alone could scrub away crusted lasagna. He took my seat at the table without noticing. Or maybe he noticed and just didn't care. Either way, the message was the same. You don't matter here. Breakfast was a chorus of, "Is there more bacon?" and "We're out of cereal," and "Did you get the almond milk I like?" They all had preferences now. Demands, really. Like royalty at court. I cooked scrambled eggs that never seemed fluffy enough. I sliced fruit that went untouched. I poured juice and refilled mugs and wiped sticky counters, always trailing behind them, cleaning up the evidence of their comfort. And me, I'd nibble a crust of toast between tasks, chew cold leftovers after everyone had gone to the living room. I started hiding snacks in the back of the cupboard like a mouse saving crumbs. Once I made myself a tuna sandwich, just one, and when I turned around for the kettle, I came back to find it gone, eaten, no apology, no acknowledgement, just gone. When I asked, he laughed. "Oh, that was yours," like the idea of me claiming something was a joke, like I wasn't allowed to take up even that much space. And the others, they laughed too. Not cruelly, just carelessly, like it was all harmless fun. But there is no harmlessness in being made invisible. One afternoon I found the refrigerator open, not just ajar, open, wide, blasting cold air into the kitchen. Someone had left it like that again. I called out, "Can someone come close the fridge?" No answer. I wiped my hands and shut it myself. Later, when the milk turned sour, no one admitted to it. They just asked why I hadn't replaced it yet. That same week, I'd made a beautiful roasted chicken, golden crisp skinned, stuffed with lemon and herbs from my own garden. I had planned to eat it quietly, just me and the ticking clock. I hadn't told anyone, but somehow they found out. and by the time I came back from hanging laundry on the line, it was already carved, torn apart, picked over like vultures had landed. Not a note, not a saved plate, just a stripped carcass in a greasy pan. It was never about the food, not really. It was what the food meant. In our house, cooking had once been an act of love, of remembering who liked what, of healing with soup, of celebrating with cake. But now it was just obligation, routine, something they expected like the rising sun, something they consumed without thanks, without thought, without the smallest flicker of grace. Even on Sundays, the one day I used to set the table with linen napkins and light a candle, they'd come late, or not at all. They'd grab a plate and sit in front of the TV eating with their legs spread and their phones glowing in their hands. I'd sit across the room, upright napkin on my lap, waiting for someone to join me. They never did. And still I cooked. Still I fed them. Still I cleaned up after the feast like some haunted ghost who didn't know she was already dead to the world around her. But one night it changed. Just a small thing. But small things matter. I'd made a peach cobbler, the kind their father used to love. Took me 2 hours. Peaches peeled by hand crust, folded with butter, chilled just right. I set it out to cool. It smelled like sunlight and memory. I told them that cobbler is for tomorrow. Next morning, half of it was gone. Knife marks straight through the middle. Someone had eaten from the dish with a spoon right out of the pan. I stood there staring at the jagged line of theft because that's what it felt like, and something inside me cracked. Not a big explosion, more like a thread being pulled until the whole hem came undone. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just packed it up, the rest of the cobbler, into a plastic container and walked it across the street to the elderly widow who lived alone. She opened the door in her robe, eyes surprised. I made too much, I said. Would you like some? She held it like it was gold. That evening, for the first time in years, I didn't set the table. I didn't make dinner. I didn't even enter the kitchen. I sat in my room with a book and a bowl of plain yogurt. No one came looking. No one knocked. The only message I got was a text from my daughter. Did you forget dinner tonight? No, I didn't forget. I just stopped serving kings from a throne they never knew they sat on. I just started remembering what it felt like to eat alone, without resentment on the plate. And I liked it. A mouth too many a name, too loud. That's how it started to feel with him in the house, louder than the rest, somehow always needing something, always occupying the space with an arrogance that didn't match the thinness of his contribution. He made noise without listening, demands without awareness, presence without gratitude, and over time it wasn't just him anymore. It was what he represented, that sense that anyone could show up and expect the world from me, while offering nothing in return but dirty dishes and an echo of entitlement. He had opinions about everything. The coffee was too weak, the pillows too flat. My antique teacups, the ones passed down from my own mother, were too dainty, so he drank from a plastic tumbler he'd left on the floor like a forgotten toy. He played his music loud enough to shake the walls, something with heavy bass and empty lyrics, and when I asked him to turn it down, he looked at me like I was ancient stone. "This isn't a library," he said. He called me lady, not auntie, not by my name, not with care, just lady like I was some faceless woman ringing him up at the corner store. And the way he said it, sharp, dismissive, layered with that particular tone men get when they think the world owes them comfort, and the women around them should feel lucky to provide it. He once shouted across the house, shouted to ask where the clean towels were. Not walked, not asked gently. Shouted. I stood frozen in the laundry room holding one of those very towels, and I realized that to him I was a service bell. Push the button, receive the thing. My name, irrelevant. My dignity, forgettable. just a noise to summon what he needed. At dinner, he'd speak over everyone, always the center of attention, always spinning stories about his big plans and connections, none of which ever materialized. When I tried to speak to offer a thought, a memory, even a light-hearted comment, he'd talk louder. Or worse, he'd interrupt with, "No offense, but this is kinda boring." And they'd laugh. My children. They laughed with him, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't see it. They didn't see me. Not anymore. Once he brought up selling the house. My house. Said it had potential if we just updated the interior and got rid of the old lady stuff. He meant my lace curtains, my family portraits, the carved sideboard my husband made by hand. "You'd get a great price in this market," he said, like he was doing me a favor. I didn't answer. I just refilled my glass of water and looked out the window at the dying hydrangeas. I hadn't watered them in days. I used to tend to them lovingly, snipping the dead blooms, coaxing the color back each spring. But now, I barely noticed them. And maybe that was the point. Everything I loved had become invisible even to me. He'd started leaving food wrappers in the couch cushions, licked fingers wiped on throw pillows, socks in the hallway, wet towels on the bathroom floor. I'd quietly pick them up, always quietly, until the morning I stepped in something sticky juice or soda or who knows what and nearly fell. My hip wrenched, my wrist caught the counter just in time, and still no one asked if I was okay. They just kept talking in the other room as if I were some background noise like the wind or the hum of the fridge. That night something shifted. Not a scream, not a collapse, just a quiet sealing of something inside me. A gate closing, a lock clicking. I began to move differently, slower not from age, but from deliberation, from observation. I stopped speaking when they interrupted. I stopped offering when they forgot to thank me. I stopped responding to the barks of Lady and, "Where's the?" He noticed. "You good?" he asked one day, his tone more irritation than concern. I smiled, a small, tight smile. "Just a little tired," I said. But I wasn't tired. I was watching how none of them thought twice about my effort, how the meals appeared like magic, how the floors stayed clean, the towels cycled, the bills paid, how the home remained intact, not because of luck, but because of me. And yet I was treated like a footnote. I thought about my own mother then, how she used to say, "If they won't speak your name with kindness, stop answering to it." I never understood what she meant when I was young. I thought she was being dramatic, but now I understood. There comes a time when a woman's silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. It's her reclaiming her time, her dignity, her space. So I made myself invisible, not bitterly, not spitefully, just quietly. I stopped restocking their favorites. Let the almond milk run out. Let the chips stay gone. I folded my own laundry and left theirs in the basket. I made myself tea 1 cup and didn't offer any extras. I walked past their mess and let it sit. And the best part, they didn't notice. Not really. They just thought I was slipping, aging. "She forgets things now," one of them whispered. "She's not as sharp." Let them think that. Let them believe I was fading. It gave me room to breathe, room to plan, room to remember who I was before they turned me into a shadow of myself. Because their voices were loud, yes, but inside me something softer had begun to grow. A voice I hadn't heard in years, my own. No room for respect, only demands. That's what the house had become. A place where the air buzzed with requests, but never gratitude, where I was seen only through the lens of what I could offer: a ride, a meal, a bed, a clean sink. Not one person stopped to ask if I wanted to offer any of it. They assumed I did. They assumed I always would. That's the danger of being the dependable one. People forget you're not invincible. It had been 3 weeks since the nephew arrived, and already his presence had soaked into the walls like cigarette smoke, bitter, clingy, impossible to ignore. He had taken over my living room like a king in exile. His laundry trailed across the floor. His video game controller was always charging. I found energy drink cans wedged between couch cushions, and I started to wonder if he thought the coffee table was just a fancy trash bin. One day I came downstairs and found my reading chair missing. Moved. Pushed awkwardly into the corner to make room for a second-hand keyboard he'd hauled in from who knows where. "I'm learning piano," he said, grinning. "Don't worry, I'll keep it chill." That lasted exactly 1 evening. The next night I heard him pounding out some tuneless nonsense well past midnight, keys clanging like someone kicking a bag of wrenches. I knocked gently. "Could you keep it down, dear? I'm trying to sleep." He sighed like I was the inconvenience and said, "It's not that loud." I stood there in my own hallway wearing the slippers I'd worn for 15 years, feeling like a stranger in my own home. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't smile. I didn't explain. I just turned away. The next day I made a pot of stew, a thick, hearty beef stew the way my husband used to like it. The smell filled the whole house. I made it for myself, just me. I left it simmering, the lid askew to let the scent tease the air, and sure enough, he wandered in. "Yo, what's cooking?" "That smells fire." I said nothing. I ladled a bowl for myself and walked out to the garden. I sat beneath the dying orange tree with the chip spoon I loved, and ate slowly, feeling the heat work its way into the cold places inside me. When I came back in, the pot was half empty, and my bowl was in the sink still full of soap, like a message written in suds. "You don't own peace here, not even for an hour." That night I got a headache. My knees hurt. My back was pinched from scrubbing the baseboards the day before, not because anyone asked me to, but because it's the kind of thing I do when I want to feel like something is still in order. I took a moment, leaned against the doorframe of the laundry room and thought, what if I didn't? What if I stopped doing it all? So the next day I didn't. I didn't start the laundry. I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't make the coffee. I sat in the sunroom with a crossword puzzle and pretended to forget how the house worked. By 10 a.m., the complaints began. "There's no clean socks. Did you buy more eggs? Where's the coffee?" Each voice tossed into the air like pebbles thrown at a window, but I didn't open it. I just kept writing 4 across 5-letter word for freedom. I penciled in space. That afternoon, the nephew actually knocked. "Hey, the Wi-Fi's down." I looked up slowly, and he blinked. "Can you, fix it?" "No." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. "No." "That's right," I said. "No." He left in a huff, muttering something about old people and attitude, but I didn't care. I had found something that day, something small but dangerous. The power of withholding, the power of not bending. It's strange how quickly they turn when you stop being useful. When your yeses dry up, they scramble to replace them with their own systems, or else they complain, sulk, or call you crazy. "She's just tired," my daughter said over the phone later that evening, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. "She's not herself lately." But the truth was, I was finally becoming myself again. The version of me that didn't take crumbs with a thank you, the one who knew how to say enough. That night I went to bed early. I left the dishes in the sink. I left the living room light on. I didn't do the little dance of nightly rituals that kept the house humming. I let it creak, let it breathe its own mess for once. And as I lay under my quilt, I listened to them move about in confusion, opening cupboards, rattling pans, calling out for things that no longer magically appeared. And I smiled, not the tight, tired smile I used to give, a different one, a real one, because I knew slowly, quietly, I was reclaiming something I'd given away, piece by piece, over years of soft-spun servitude. Respect. Not from them, not yet, but from myself. And that I was beginning to learn was the only kind that lasts. Invisible ink on a family tree. That's what I felt like. My name was still there, technically scribbled somewhere at the top as Mom or Aunt, like a decorative heading. But the ink had faded. I wasn't part of the new pages. I wasn't someone to be remembered or listened to, just someone to be cited occasionally, as in, "We're staying at Mom's," or "Ask Auntie if we can use the garage." I had become background, a character without dialogue in a story I once wrote. It's hard to trace exactly when the erasure began. It didn't happen all at once, but in quiet paper-cut ways. Years ago, I was the first call if someone was sick, if a birthday was coming up, if there was a fight or a baby or a wedding to plan. I was woven into the fabric of every event, not always at the center, but present. Now I found out things after the fact. I learned from social media that my grandson had a recital. I heard from the neighbor that my niece had a baby shower. I was no longer consulted, only informed, and sometimes not even that. There was a dinner just a few months ago where the family gathered around the table without me. It was supposed to be a casual pizza night. Nothing fancy, just grabbing a few slices, my daughter had said. And yet they posted photos later, laughter and candles and wine glasses clinking, my dining room in the background, my dishes on the table. But I hadn't been invited. I was upstairs that night with a mild headache. They didn't check in, didn't knock, just carried on below me like I was some sleeping dog that didn't need to be disturbed. When I brought it up gently later with a smile that tasted like vinegar, they said, "Oh, we thought you were resting. We didn't want to bother you." Bother me. Imagine that being a bother in your own home. After that, I began to notice more, how my stories were always cut short, how they'd glance at their phones while I was speaking, how my opinions were old-fashioned, my clothes too frumpy, my music depressing. When did I stop being wise and start being inconvenient? Even my recipes, the ones written in my own looping hand passed down from my mother and her mother before her, were no longer respected. They'd tweak them, modernize them, add kale where it didn't belong, remove the butter, the soul, the flavor, and if I mentioned it, I was too attached to the past. Of course I was attached. The past is where they loved me. They used to run to me, crawl into my lap, ask me for stories, bring me dandelions like they were bouquets of gold. They used to ask me to brush their hair, to tie their shoes, to sit beside them until they fell asleep. Now they barely looked me in the eye. And yet they never forgot to ask for favors. "Can you pick up the kids? Can we crash at your place this weekend? Would you mind watching the dog while we go away?" I nodded. I said yes. I said of course, like a prayer, because saying yes made me feel useful, and usefulness I thought was the last thread tethering me to them. Until I realized usefulness is not love. One morning I opened the hallway closet, the one where we used to hang their little coats with mittens dangling from the sleeves, and I saw that it had been overtaken, not with love, but with stuff, boxes of their things, bags of donations they never dropped off, broken appliances they swore they'd fix. They had turned my space into a storage unit, and me, I was just the night manager, quiet, reliable, invisible. I pulled down one of the boxes, curious, and inside I found old photo albums, my albums crammed beneath a stack of dusty board games and a rusty waffle iron. I opened the top album, and there we were. Me and their father Young grinning, holding babies in the backyard sun. There were birthdays, bike rides, beach days, pages thick with moments I had kept safe all these years. And that's when I saw it. The erasure had started long before they moved in. It had begun the moment they started growing up, and I let myself shrink down. I stopped making noise, stopped needing things, stopped reminding them I was more than a cook, more than a roof, more than the person behind the camera. I had erased myself too, but not anymore. That night I pulled out a clean notebook and wrote down a list. Not groceries, not chores, just names. Names of people who still saw me. My old friend B from the church who always sent a card. The librarian who always asked about my garden. The neighbor who brought me muffins when I had the flu. And then at the bottom I wrote my own name. Slowly, carefully, like it mattered. Because it did. The next morning I cleared the dining room table not for dinner, but for me. I spread out those old albums and began restoring them, repairing torn pages, rewriting captions. I brought myself back into focus. And when the nephew passed by and said, "What you doing, lady? I didn't even look up," I just kept writing. Leftovers and cold shoulders. That's what I came down to that Sunday evening. A kitchen strewn with crusted plates, greasy pans abandoned in the sink, and a single half-eaten takeout box sitting on the stove like some pitiful offering. The air still smelled of soy sauce and something fried, and I could hear their laughter drifting in from the living room, careless and full, like nothing had been missing. Like I hadn't. I had spent that afternoon in my bedroom quiet by choice. I was nursing a low fever, my joints aching, my head swimming a little from too much bending and not enough rest. I thought surely someone would check in, ask if I wanted soup, a blanket, even a glass of water. But no one came. No one noticed. At some point I dozed off, not deeply, just the kind of surface sleep old women drift in and out of, always half listening for the world to remember them. When I woke, it was dark. The hallway was silent. My stomach was a hollow ache. I made my way down the stairs slowly, one hand gripping the rail, the other resting on my ribs like something might come loose if I wasn't careful. And then I saw it, the mess, the silence, the greasy trail of their satisfaction left behind. Not a plate saved, not a note left, just emptiness, the kind of emptiness that echoes. I stood there, one hand on the fridge, trying not to cry. Not because I hadn't eaten, I'd gone hungry before in other lifetimes, other ways. No, it wasn't about food. It was about what it symbolized. I was no longer included. I opened the fridge and found a bruised apple and half a container of yogurt that expired 3 days ago. I peeled it back anyway, ate it standing up, chewed slowly like I was trying to swallow shame. That's the thing about neglect. It doesn't scream. It whispers over time until your name becomes an afterthought. Later, I found the receipt on the counter. They'd ordered enough food for everyone, more than enough. Multiple entrees, extras, but nothing for me. Not even the courtesy of assuming I might want something. I tried to picture the moment, their fingers swiping through the menu, scrolling past item after item. Did none of them think, wait, what about her? Or worse, maybe they had, and decided I didn't matter. I stood there far too long, the overhead light buzzing faintly, the silence pressing in from all sides. I wanted to scream, to throw the containers in the sink, to break the plate that had once belonged to my grandmother, but I didn't. I cleaned, like I always did. I threw out their boxes, wiped down their crumbs, took out the trash, and then I sat, at the table, alone. No place setting, no lit candle, no steaming bowl, just me. And I stared at the empty place where I used to serve love, and I thought, they've uninvited me from my own life. When one of them passed through later, he said, "You didn't eat with us," like it was a question, like the decision hadn't already been made without me. I said nothing, just kept folding the tea towel in my lap. He nodded already, walking away, earbuds in back to his noise. I waited until the house was still again after their movie, after their laughter faded, after the toilet flushed, and the lights clicked off. Then I made myself a cup of tea. Not my usual mug. I chose the good china, the one with the tiny violets that I used to reserve for guests who never appreciated it. I poured the hot water slowly, let the steam rise, sat in the quiet, and let the heat warm my hands. And I thought about all the places in this house where I used to be seen, the photos I took, the Band-Aids I applied, the nights I sat awake with worry, the birthdays I planned down to the last ribbon, the school projects I helped assemble, the years I spent making it feel like home. And now I was the ghost, the fixture, the background hum. No more. I didn't decide in that moment to change everything, but I did decide something smaller and maybe more powerful. They will not feed off me without seeing me anymore. They will not build their comfort on the bones of my silence. So I drank my tea, every drop, slowly, like a ritual. And when I placed the cup in the sink, I didn't wash it right away. Let them see what it's like to live with my presence again. Not just my labor, not just my compliance. Me. The phone call that cracked my silence came on a morning that began like all the others, quiet, cold, and coated with routine. I had just folded the last towel and was setting it on the stack when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. These days, it was rarely for me. Telemarketers' wrong numbers or one of the children calling only to ask for something. But this time, it was her, B. I hadn't heard her voice in over a year, not since her husband passed and she moved closer to her son in the city. We used to meet every Tuesday at the bakery on Main, 2 black coffees, 1 shared cinnamon roll, and an hour of talking like we were still 30. She was the only one who still looked me in the eye and asked, "And how are you really?" "Good Lord," she said, laughing as soon as I picked up. "I thought you'd dropped off the earth." I smiled a real one and sat down slowly at the kitchen table, wrapping the cord around my fingers like I used to when I was younger, when phone calls were sacred and the person on the other end mattered more than the noise around you. "I almost did," I said quietly, or maybe I just faded out a little. We talked for nearly an hour, not about illness, not about politics or bills or aches. We talked about us. She told me she'd started painting again. Little watercolor scenes from memory, her garden in spring, her husband's old boots, her own hands. She said something that stayed with me like a whisper. I stopped waiting for someone to make space for me. I started carving it myself. After we hung up, I sat in that chair long after the dial tone faded. Something about her words had unsettled me, not in a painful way, but like a locked window, being cracked open for the first time in years. I stopped waiting. How long had I been waiting for someone to see me, to thank me, to remember me? I looked around the kitchen, noticed the places where I'd allowed myself to disappear, the cabinet full of snacks I didn't eat, the coat hooks with jackets that weren't mine, the fridge cluttered with notes and reminders that didn't include me. It was like I was walking through someone else's life, like I had become the museum caretaker of a home no longer mine. That afternoon I took a walk. Not a long one, just around the block, but it felt like rebellion. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't leave a note. I didn't check the time. I walked with my spine straight and my arms swinging slightly like I used to when I was still working, still sharp, still me. The sun was gentle, and the breeze carried the scent of someone's garden rosemary, maybe. I stopped by the park and watched a group of children chase each other around the swings, their laughter unburdened and wild. One little girl stopped near me to tie her shoelace. She looked up, caught my eye, and smiled. That smile, pure unfiltered, nearly undid me. I smiled back, nodded, and kept walking. When I returned home, no one had noticed I was gone. Not a single soul had sent a message called out, asked. And instead of feeling sad, I felt powerful, as if I had proven something to myself. I could leave, and the sky would not fall. I could take time for me, and the earth would keep turning. That evening, I pulled out the old photo album again, not to weep over it, but to reclaim it. I took notes, labeled faces, circled the corners where the tape had yellowed. These were my stories, my legacy. I would not let them be buried under pizza boxes and careless conversations. Then I did something even smaller but braver. I made a single serving of my favorite meal, just one: roasted vegetables, a slice of goat cheese, warm bread with real butter. I set one plate, lit one candle, sat at the table and ate every bite, not quickly, not from a tray in front of the TV, but like I mattered. And as I chewed, I realized something else. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I didn't want revenge. What I wanted was space, distance, clarity. After dinner, I called the lawyer, left a message, asked to schedule a meeting to review some old documents. I said it casually, but my voice didn't shake. They say the truth sets you free, but they don't tell you how quiet it is at first, like the hush before a song begins. And that's what this felt like, the first few notes of something new, something mine. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not yet. I kept the details tucked away close to the chest, not out of fear, but out of love for myself. Some awakenings don't need an audience. A house of ghosts, not love. That's what I finally admitted to myself as I stood in the hallway that once echoed with laughter birthday songs, the creak of little feet running too fast in socks. The walls were the same, but the warmth had faded. Or maybe it was peeled away layer by every sigh I swallowed, and every disrespect I let slide. The memories still lived here, but the love that created them had long been pushed into the corners like dust. I walked room to room one afternoon quietly, as if touring a place I used to live. The guest bedroom, once my reading nook, now filled with duffel bags and dirty laundry. The laundry room, my haven of order, now held their damp clothes left in the washer too long, smelling of mildew and carelessness. My bathroom had become communal. I had to knock before entering my own space. My own mirror didn't even belong to me anymore. It was fogged with steam from showers I hadn't taken, speckled with toothpaste from mouths that never said, "Thank you." I opened the closet in the hallway, the one where I used to keep the linens I folded so carefully, and found it crammed with boxes of their junk. Old gaming consoles, shoes that didn't fit, broken electronics they might fix someday. My grandmother's hand-stitched quilts were buried beneath it all. I held one up, smelled the lavender sachet I had placed there years ago, long faded. It smelled like silence. Even my garden, my last sanctuary, had been trampled. Someone had set up folding chairs on top of the lavender beds. Beer cans hid behind the rose bushes. The bird bath I used to fill every morning now had cigarette butts floating in murky water. I didn't even know who smoked. This was no longer a home. It was a resting place for people passing through, and I was the one expected to stay behind to keep sweeping up their footprints as they moved on without me. That evening, I sat down with a piece of paper, just a blank sheet and a pen. I wrote at the top, "What is mine?" The list was short. A few heirlooms, a few recipes, a memory of a beach trip, a pair of earrings my husband gave me when we still danced in the kitchen, just the two of us, no audience, no noise. Then I wrote another question. What have I given away? The list was endless. Time, energy, privacy, voice, presence, space, Love given with no receipt, no acknowledgement, as if it were air and not sacrifice. I had handed out pieces of myself like free samples in a store, smiling, generous, invisible. I began to cry, not because I was sad, though sadness was there like a shadow, but because I was done. And it hurt to be done with people you love. It hurt to let go of the idea that they'd change, that they'd see you, that they'd say we've taken too much. They wouldn't. They didn't even know they had. And in that realization, something inside me clicked into place. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't a prisoner. I was simply the only one who remembered the house used to be holy, a place of stories and songs, of stitched napkins and warm casseroles, of slow mornings and hands held across the table. They had forgotten, but I hadn't, and that meant I could take it back. The next morning I made a pot of coffee, just for me. I used the French press, the one I always saved for guests. I sat in the armchair by the front window, the one they always moved to make space for their noise, and I drank it while watching the morning unfold. No one spoke to me, no one asked me what I was doing, and I didn't offer. Later that day I began clearing things, not loudly, not out of spite, but with purpose. I took down the flyer they'd pinned to the fridge for someone's fundraiser I was never invited to. I boxed up the spare shoes littered by the back door. I started sorting drawers, reclaiming space, not waiting for permission. And I noticed the more I moved with quiet determination, the more uncomfortable they became. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. I smiled. "I'm cleaning." "Oh," they said. "Spring cleaning." "No," I said gently, "soul cleaning." They laughed awkwardly, not understanding, but that was fine. I wasn't doing this for them. That night I slept with the window open, listened to the wind moving through the trees, the soft rustle of the house as it settled. I imagined it sighing, not from exhaustion, but from relief, like it too had been waiting for someone to remember it was once a sanctuary. And I promised myself this: I would no longer be a ghost in a house of guests. If I was to live here, I would live fully, seen, heard, respected. And if they couldn't make room for that, then maybe they were the ones who needed to go. The inheritance they all expected, that's what kept them tethered to me in the end. Not my stories, not the meals, not the years of mothering and mending and making space, but the vague, unspoken promise of something waiting for them in my will. I could feel it like a weight in the air whenever they looked at me. The politeness in their voices when I talked about the house, the sudden interest when I mentioned the bank, the way they perked up at the word someday, and when I'm gone. It had always been there, subtle, in the way they asked about repairs on the roof or reminded me how much the property had appreciated. "You're sitting on gold here," one of them said once, patting the kitchen counter like it was a poker chip. I smiled. I always smiled. But inside something curled up and recoiled. That same something stirred now older, wiser, no longer content to be passive. I had written my will years ago, back when my husband was alive. It was simple then, everything to him, and in the event of his passing, equally divided between the children. Back when I believed they'd take care of it, of each other, of me. But now I wasn't so sure they would take care of anything except themselves. They assumed they knew what was coming to them. That's why they stayed, why they tolerated me, why they threw just enough breadcrumbs of civility to keep the illusion of family intact. I could see it in their eyes, the calculation, the assumption, that I was the bridge they had to cross gently in order to reach the treasure on the other side. They didn't see the bridge could burn. One evening, I sat at the desk in the study, the old oak desk where my husband used to pay the bills, line up the pencils in neat rows. I opened the drawer, pulled out the copy of the will, and reread every line. The legal words felt like paper armor, so official, so final, and yet not a single one of them reflected the truth of what my life had become. Did these children, now grown careless, loud deserve what I had built? Did they know the weight of every dollar saved, every mortgage paid on time, every holiday made special with nothing but flour, sugar, and love? I thought about the heirlooms, the property, the life insurance. I imagined it all in their hands, the same hands that left crumbs on my couch, that scrolled through their phones while I spoke, that dropped their laundry at my feet like I was the help, and I felt sick. Because here's the truth, what we leave behind is not just money, it's memory, it's message, it's the story we write with our last breath, the lesson we offer after we're gone. And I would not let my final act be handing riches to people who had made me feel so poor. So I made an appointment. I didn't tell them, I didn't explain. I just called the lawyer and said calmly I'd like to update my estate plan. The receptionist asked if there had been a death. I said yes, quietly mine. That week I gathered the paperwork, bank statements, property titles, the deed to the house. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea and thought of every time they had taken me for granted, every time they'd assumed I'd be there, wallet open fridge, full eyes closed. And then I wrote a new list, not of names, of values, who had shown up when I was sick, who had called just to say hello without asking for anything, who had remembered my birthday, who had listened, really listened when I spoke of grief, of age, of loneliness. The list was not long, but it was clear. And when I met with the lawyer, I was calm, firm, not cruel. I want to leave my estate, I said to people who still see me, who remember who I am, who care for what I care for. He asked for specifics. And so I told him about the local women's shelter that helped mothers fleeing abuse, about the scholarship fund my husband once dreamed of starting, about the neighbor who checked on me during the blackout and brought me a flashlight and a warm smile. And yes, I left something for the children, a small piece, enough to acknowledge but not enough to reward apathy, a token, a reminder. He raised an eyebrow when I finished. "Are you sure?" he asked. I looked at him and said I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That night I returned home to noise. The nephew had people over again. The TV blared. Someone had spilled something sticky on the kitchen floor. No one noticed me walk in. No one asked where I'd been. I moved through them like a ghost, not because they had banished me, but because I had outgrown them. They had no idea what was coming, and I didn't need them to. Because the inheritance they all expected, it was never really about money. It was about my time, my trust, my presence, and I was taking it back, piece by piece, not in anger, in truth, in peace, in power, more than a mouth a mirror. That's what he had become to me in the final days of his stay, though I doubt he ever knew. That nephew sprawled across my couch like a prince in exile, barking requests and living off the fruits of my quiet labor. He thought he was just using up space, just being young and free and careless. But what he really was my reflection, a living reminder of how far I had let things slide, of how small I had made myself so others could stretch out without consequence. I watched him one morning from the hallway. He was eating cereal out of the mixing bowl. Of course, not a proper dish, legs, spread TV on phone in hand. And I had this moment, this slow dawning awareness. He's not the problem. I am. I had allowed him, all of them, to believe this was acceptable. I had taught them that I existed to be stepped around, that my boundaries were suggestions, that my home, my time, my body were open plans. And it didn't start with him. It started years ago, when I said yes instead of I need rest, when I laughed off slights instead of saying, that hurt me, when I cleaned up messes, literal and emotional, and never once asked who would clean mine, when I swallowed disappointment like it was communion, when I confused silence for strength. He was not just an extra mouth. He was a mirror, and in that reflection I saw not just his entitlement, but my own erosion. I remembered the first time I felt small in my own home. It wasn't recent. It was the day my youngest came home from college and told me, "You wouldn't understand, Mom. Things are different now." I'd been trying to relate to share something I don't even remember what, but I was dismissed with a shrug and a smile, and I let it go. I remembered the time I was left off a family group chat because you don't really use your phone, do you? Even though I checked it every morning, just hoping for a message that wasn't a forwarded meme or a vague request. These were not isolated incidents. They were roots that had grown deep and quiet under the foundation of this house, roots of forgetting, and I had let them spread. But now I was seeing them clearly, pulling them up, one at a time. That week I began doing something I hadn't done in years. I said no. Not always out loud, sometimes in small ways. I didn't restock the snack drawer. I didn't offer rides. I didn't pick up the phone on the first ring. When they asked if I'd bake something for the potluck, I smiled and said, "Not this time." When they asked what was for dinner, I replied, "Whatever you decide to cook." I wasn't angry when I said it, just honest. At first they were confused, then annoyed, and then something remarkable happened. They adapted. The nephew started washing his own laundry. Badly, yes, but he did it. He even asked where the detergent was. The others began to ask if I was planning meals instead of assuming I was. And once my daughter even said, "Can I bring dinner for you this week?" As if the fog had lifted and she'd realized I was more than a background hum. But the most important shift wasn't theirs. It was mine. I started making time for myself again. Long walks, afternoon naps. I read books without guilt. I let the dishes sit in the sink overnight and didn't apologize to anyone. I reclaimed not just time but dignity, presence. And that presence changed the way I saw everything. I no longer felt the need to explain my worth. I no longer waited for their approval or recognition. I knew in the marrow of my bones that I was more than what I gave, that I was not a vault to be opened only when convenient. I was not a kitchen. I was not a couch. I was not a will waiting to be read. I was a woman who had given everything and finally decided to give something to herself. One night I sat on the back porch alone. The air was cool. The stars were out. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel lonely. I felt solitary, and there is a difference. Loneliness is hunger. Solitude is choice. That nephew, he was still here for now, but the house had changed. And more importantly, I had. I no longer moved around him. He moved around me. The axis had shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it had shifted all the same. He was still loud, still careless, still asking too much. But now I didn't bend to meet him. I let him trip on the boundaries I had quietly built. And every time he did, I smiled. Not out of malice, out of memory, because I remembered who I was. And that was worth more than anything they'd ever inherit. The silence after the storm was not the chaos I had feared, it was peace. Not a sudden dramatic break, but a slow, gentle hush. The kind of quiet that settles over a field after the wind has passed. It began when I stopped answering. Just stopped. No announcements, no dramatics. I simply let their voices ring out into the void. Where's the peanut butter? Silence. Did you wash my hoodie? Silence. Are we still doing Sunday dinner? Silence. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. The noise of my own soul came forward. That inner hum I hadn't heard in years. The voice that used to narrate my thoughts before they became so busy attending to others. I heard it again. Soft, clear, me. At first they didn't notice. Silence was after all my default. The obedient kind. The warm, smiling kind. But this was different. This silence had weight. It had intention. And slowly it began to unsettle them. I stopped reminding them of things, appointments, birthdays, bills. I stopped picking up behind them no longer their quiet shadow with a dustpan. When they left dishes in the sink, I left them there. When they used the last of the milk, I didn't replace it. When the living room was cluttered with shoes and bags and wrappers, I simply stepped over it. They began to ask again, "Is everything okay?" And I would look them in the eye and say, "I'm fine." Nothing more, not angry, not passive, just true. Because I was fine. I was no longer running myself ragged trying to hold together a family that didn't realize I'd become the mortar. I was stepping out of the wall entirely, letting it fall if it had to. The nephew he noticed first. He came to me one evening more cautious than usual. Did I do something wrong? I looked at him, truly looked, his face young but tired, his eyes searching for permission. And I saw a boy in a man's body, hungry for safety, for stability, for something soft to land on. I shook my head. "No," I said. "You just forgot I was human." He blinked, stunned, and for once he didn't talk back. The others followed suit in their own ways. My daughter called more. My son started asking if I needed anything when he visited, not with obligation in his voice, but with sincerity. It wasn't perfect. Not all of them noticed, and some still didn't understand, but that no longer mattered. Because the silence I had created was not empty, it was sacred. A space where I could breathe. A space where I no longer had to prove my usefulness to earn respect. A space where I could finally sit still and be seen by the one person whose gaze had grown the dimmest over time mine. I spent mornings sitting outside with my tea watching the sun stretch across the garden like a golden shawl. I spent afternoons napping when I was tired, not because I was weak, but because I was allowed. I started listening to old records, the kind that reminded me of dancing barefoot in the living room, back when love didn't have to be earned by labor. One day I received a thank you note from the neighbor's teenage daughter. It read, "Thank you for the cookies last week. I don't know if you remember me, but they made me feel like someone saw me." I pressed the note to my chest and cried, because yes, I remembered her. I remembered making that batch of cookies just to have something warm in the house. I gave her 3 in a paper napkin when she came to return a rake her father borrowed. She had seen me, and I had seen her, and that was all I needed. We cannot force people to cherish us, but we can decide not to shrink. We can decide not to overextend. We can decide that silence is not a punishment, it's a sanctuary. A few days later, someone asked, "Are we still doing Thanksgiving here this year?" And I replied without hesitation, no. Just that. No explanation. No guilt. No maybe next time. Because I had stopped waiting for them to understand. I had stopped negotiating with the part of me that thought being loved meant being depleted. I chose silence. And in that silence I found a sound I'd forgotten. Myself. One final dinner for me. No guests, no fanfare, no placemats aligned in rows or folding chairs dragged in from the garage. Just a single plate, One knife, one fork, and a cloth napkin. I ironed smooth, not for show, but because I wanted to feel something elegant again. I didn't cook anything fancy, just what I liked. Roasted potatoes, rosemary from my own garden, a small cut of salmon pan-seared with lemon and butter, and green beans tender but still crisp, the way I preferred them, not the way others asked for them to be doctored flavored drowned in sauce. I set the table outside in the garden just as the sun was beginning to tilt toward evening. The hydrangeas were blooming again, soft, quiet reminders that beauty can return where it once faded. The lavender, though trampled, had grown back in wild, defiant clumps. I placed a candle at the center of the little iron table and lit it, even though it was still light. Not for visibility, but for ceremony. I didn't invite anyone. I didn't even tell them I was going. In fact, when I walked out, someone called from the hallway, "What's for dinner?" I didn't answer, 'cause this meal wasn't for them. It was for the girl inside me who used to dream of long tables filled with laughter and gratitude. For the young woman who once poured love into every bite and thought it would always be enough. For the wife who held her family together through holidays, illnesses, and late-night phone calls. And for the woman I had become, a woman finally ready to feed herself with her own hands. I took every bite slowly. No one interrupted. No one complained. No one asked for seconds before I'd finished my first. I chewed with intention, let the warmth of the food ground me. The candle flickered in the wind. Birds sang somewhere in the distance, low and content. I breathed deep and tasted everything, not just the food, but the moment, the peace, the power in choosing myself. After the last bite, I didn't clear the table. I left the plate, the crumbs, the glass half full. I let it sit, because I wanted to see it later. I wanted to remember that it happened, a meal, served with love, eaten without obligation, witnessed by no one but the sky and the soul inside me. When I came back inside, the kitchen was full of voices, complaints, confusion, someone rummaging in the pantry, someone opening the freezer. They didn't ask where I'd been, or if I was hungry. They just pointed to the empty fridge and said, "There's nothing here." I said, "Then maybe it's time you learn how to make something." It went quiet. Not because they were stunned, but because I didn't say it with anger. I said it like a woman who had already eaten, a woman full. That night, I wrote in my journal, the one I'd buried under years of grocery lists and doctor's appointments. I wrote down how the food tasted, how the candle looked as the wind threatened to blow it out, but didn't. How I felt full for the first time in years, not just in my stomach, but in my spine, in the air around me, in the part of me that had long been starving for acknowledgement. I wrote, "They do not have to understand. I do not have to explain. I fed myself, and it was enough." The next morning, one of them knocked on my door. "You okay?" they asked. I looked up from my book, smiled softly. "Better than I've been in years." They lingered, tried to read me, tried to find a crack to wedge themselves into, to resume the pattern we'd all accepted too long, but I didn't open the door to it. Because that dinner had changed something. It wasn't about the meal, it was about the metaphor. For once I had not asked for permission to be happy. I had taken it, and I would do it again. The letter and the lawyer, that's what sealed it. Not out of spite, not to shock them, but because it was time. Time for my final act of quiet clarity. My last redirection of the story they thought they were writing for me. For years they had assumed the ending, that I'd pass along the house like a family heirloom, that they'd divvy up the inheritance with laughter and greedy fingers, that my life's work would become their windfall. But I had rewritten the script, not out of vengeance, but in the name of dignity. I met with the lawyer again in a small sunlit office that smelled of old paper and lavender hand lotion. He was kind, patient. He offered me tea and I accepted. I sat across from him, the weight of decades folded neatly into a manila folder on my lap. I handed him the updated documents, the new will, the revised letters of instruction. He reviewed them carefully, eyes scanning the paragraphs with the same reverence one might give a confession. So he said, glancing up, "No inheritance for the children." I smiled, not bitterly, but gently, the way a seamstress might nod at a garment finely mended. I gave them more than enough already. What I have left should go where it matters now. Because here's what I had written: the house would be sold and the profits donated not to a faceless charity, but to a specific women's shelter in the city, one that helped older women get back on their feet after being discarded by the world. I had met the director once, years ago. Her hands were calloused, her eyes tired, but she spoke with fire. I remembered thinking, she's what I would have become if I'd left earlier. Or maybe she's what I still might become. The rest, what little remained in savings insurance possessions, was to be divided between 3 recipients: B for reminding me of my name, the neighbor's daughter for seeing me when I was invisible, and a small community grant to support elderly women artists because someone should help women finish the stories they were too busy living to write. I included letters with each bequest, handwritten, personal, short, but honest. To B, thank you for seeing me before I saw myself again. To the neighbor's daughter, you reminded me how powerful it is to feel seen. To the women's shelter, I used to think I had no escape. I want this to be someone else's beginning. And to my children, I left a letter too. Not cruel, not cold, just the truth. I wrote, "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, but I will have already left long before my body followed. I raised you with everything I had. I loved you deeply, with a quiet and consistent devotion that I now realize cost me more than it should have. I hope you find love true and lasting. I hope you build homes where the oldest woman at the table is the one most cherished, not the most used. I hope you understand someday why I made this choice, not to punish, but to reclaim what remained of me." I folded that letter carefully, slipped it into the envelope marked with their names, not sealed with spite, but finality. The lawyer nodded when he finished. "You're brave," he said. "No," I replied, "I'm late, but I'm finally on time for myself." As I left the office, I felt the sun on my face like an anointing. Not a dramatic transformation, just a quiet shift in posture. My spine a little straighter, my breath a little deeper. I walked 3 blocks to the park and sat on a bench I used to share with my husband. The breeze lifted the hem of my coat. Somewhere nearby, a mother was reading to her child. The world continued, and for the first time, I didn't feel like it was spinning without me. That night, I didn't sleep out of worry, but peace. I tucked the lawyer's confirmation into my desk drawer and made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile, sweetened with honey. I didn't speak a word to the house, didn't explain. I no longer owed it any. And when someone knocked on the door and said, "Do you have any cash for takeout?" I replied without turning around. "No, but there's rice and beans in the pantry." They stood there for a moment, confused, then walked away. I smiled, sipped my tea, and thought of the letter. Sometimes the final gift is not money. It's the boundary that says, "I was never yours to consume." They lost a fortune, I found freedom, and in the days that followed, the house was filled with the quiet unraveling of expectations. They didn't know yet, of course, not officially. The papers were filed. The instructions sealed the decisions already made. But even before they opened the envelope, the change in me made them uneasy. like animals sensing weather before the first drop of rain. They began to ask more questions. Where had I been? Why was I spending more time alone? Was something wrong? I'd smile softly, offer nothing, and return to my tea or my book or my walks. I didn't lie. I just stopped volunteering pieces of myself. And in that silence, they grew nervous. I noticed the shift. They began to pick up after themselves, not always, not perfectly, but enough to feel performative. Someone did the dishes without being asked. Another bought groceries without announcing it, like a parade. I was polite, grateful even, but I didn't gush. I didn't hand out gold stars for basic decency. They didn't know I had already released them. Quietly, completely. One evening the nephew, the loud one, the entitled one, came into the kitchen while I was peeling carrots. He leaned against the counter and said, "You've been kinda distant lately." I paused, looked at him, and replied, "I've just been remembering who I am." He blinked, unsure whether it was meant as a joke. "You good, though?" I nodded. "Better than you know." He left without pushing further, because the truth was the energy had shifted, and they could feel it. I was no longer orbiting around their comfort. I was no longer keeping the peace by sacrificing myself. The inheritance they had quietly counted on had been a leash, a promise I never made, but one they had believed in with utter confidence. And now, without that tether, I was free. And they were drifting. I no longer needed to confront them. There was no need to announce my decision like thunder. I had written my truth on paper, placed it in the hands of someone whose job it was to guard it. Let the lawyer be the messenger. Let the ink carry my voice. I had already said everything I needed to say through action. The last weekend before I asked them all to leave, I took a walk through each room, not with sadness, with ceremony. I touched the corner of the dining table, remembering every holiday meal I had ever prepared. I pressed my fingers against the banister worn smooth by the hands of children long grown and now far removed. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and whispered, "Thank you, not to the people but to the space. The labor, the laughter, the life I had built there." And then I packed a single suitcase. I didn't leave because I was forced to. I left because I chose to. I found a small cottage not far from the edge of town, nestled between a grove of eucalyptus and a stream that whispered rather than roared. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't large. But it was mine, paid for in full. No one else's name on the deed, no mouths to feed, no demands. Just silence. Not the hollow kind, the sacred kind. I filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and rosemary. I grew basil in a pot outside the window. I called Bee and invited her for coffee. I baked a peach cobbler and gave it to the mailwoman just because. I slept in late some days, woke early others. I wrote in my journal every morning, each page beginning with, "You are still here, and that is enough." Eventually the lawyer delivered the news. I don't know how they reacted. I wasn't there to watch the confusion bloom into disbelief, the disappointment curdle into resentment. I didn't need to be. That wasn't my burden anymore. I had done what women like me almost never do. I had chosen myself late, but not too late. I had written a different ending. And maybe in time they'd understand. Maybe not. That was no longer my concern. Because I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. Now the days pass softly. The mornings are my own, slow and unhurried. I watch the sun filter through the lace curtain, dancing across the worn wood floors like an old friend. I move gently now, not from fragility, but from knowing there's no one rushing me anymore. Time doesn't chase me like it once did. Some days I bake, some days I read, some days I do nothing at all, and for the first time in my life, that feels like something sacred. Like choosing stillness is a kind of power. There are no doors slamming, no voices shouting down my silence, just birdsong, wind, the occasional rustle of leaves that sounds a little like freedom. The ache in my knees still comes and goes, but the ache in my heart, the one that came from being overlooked, overstretched, outloved that's gone now, eased not by time but by truth. People ask if I'm lonely. No, I am solitary, and solitude is the space where healing lives. When I think back on all those years, I don't carry bitterness, only understanding. I did what I thought was right. I gave all I had. But now, finally, I've learned that giving doesn't have to mean disappearing. And what I've kept for myself now feels like a kind of quiet wealth. I don't wait at the window anymore. I don't listen for footsteps in the hall. I don't shrink to fit the shape of their expectations. I just sit, breathe, sip tea slowly, and I smile. Because I am not lost. I am simply free.